When should you start and end a scene in Mythic Game Master Emulator? This may sound like a weird question, but it's really not always obvious. Say you have an adventurer exploring a haunted forest, and then he finds an abandoned house, so he decides to go inside and investigate. You could have a first scene where your character explores the forest, and one or more scenes where he enters the home and investigates. But you have more options than that. Should you have a scene outside the house, and then another one when he goes inside? Yeah, you could. Should you have one scene for both the inside and the outside of the house? Yeah, that could work too. What about multiple scenes inside the house? Yeah, you really could. So if those are all viable options, where does that get us? Which one should we do? Well, in this video, I will help you understand why you may want to have more scenes or fewer ones, and when it can be a good time to end a scene and start a new one. To do that, we'll go over what they say in the rules, and then I'll give you lots of examples to help you get a good grip on the concepts. There is a certain amount of personal preference and intuition when you're starting and ending scenes and where to really stop one and start the other, but I can definitely help you out a bit. As you will see, a good grasp on scenes will help you focus your story and get the most out of solo RPGing. In the past, I have covered Mythic Game Master Emulator, 2nd edition, and Conjectural Role-Playing Game Master Emulator. Both of these systems work by dividing the adventure into a series of scenes that you play through. The concept of scenes is directly borrowed from theater, books, and movies, so by using scenes you can easily give a more dramatic feel to your story. Now, here's how Mythic describes scenes. To keep your unfolding adventure within a structured narrative, Mythic divides the action into scenes. What constitutes a scene is up to you, but just like in a movie, a scene should be a discrete portion of your adventure that encapsulates an important moment or event. When the important action in that scene is over, the scene ends and we move on to the next scene. Scenes are a unit of time we use to identify what's going on and who is involved. Think of it like a movie or a show. Something happens in the scene, and certain characters are part of the action. When the main action of the scene is resolved, the scene is over and the story moves on to the next scene. Something specific happens with certain characters in a finite amount of time, and then you move on. Now, here's how CRGE describes scenes. I am including CRGE in this section because I think it is helpful to get a point of comparison. A discrete moment in time where the player characters are played. Scenes are the storytelling bread and butter of role-playing games. They exist so that the PCs have a place to act. Role-playing game scenes are usually akin to scenes in a play, a movie, or a video game, where there is a reason for placing the audience at the scene. Scenes do not necessarily need to move the grand plot, the campaign, or the chronicle, but each scene will have something to tell or some reason for being. So here are some of the key points made in these descriptions. First, scenes involve specific characters and locations. Second, scenes focus on small portions of a story. Third, scenes cover important events or important actions. Every scene has a purpose, for example, conveying information, delivering descriptions, getting characters talking, having something dramatic happen, giving a chance for your characters to act, provoking a fight, etc. I would also add that because we're playing an RPG, scenes also give you an opportunity to make checks, roll on random tables, and make fate questions. 4. When the important event or action is over, you move on to the next scene. And 5th, new scenes do not have to start where the previous one ended, so there can be ellipses. Basically, scenes are the best parts of your adventure. They are what you decide to spend time on. Therefore, scenes don't have to cover everything that your character does. Let me give you an example. If you're playing a detective story, one scene could be about searching for clues at a murder scene, while in the next one you may be following a lead, for instance by interrogating one of the suspects. So, the investigation scene may start right as the detective arrives on the premises. The main part of the scene may consist mainly of descriptions, investigation checks, and interviews, and it may end when the detective has been to every room, talked to everyone in the location, and rolled once for every piece of evidence. Meanwhile, the interrogation scene might start when you meet the suspect, and end when the conversation ends. If this scene breakdown sounds obvious to you, it's probably because detective stories are so popular already. So you already have an expectation about the kinds of scenes you may want to have, and you won't waste your time on anything boring. For example, you probably don't need to play through the morning routine of your detective, or the time before he arrives at the crime scene, or when he's discussing the case with his colleagues right after the interview. Sure, you could make scenes out of these events, but it would probably be superfluous, as there would not be much action, and it would mostly repeat information we already got. Basically, for 90% of scenes, it's fine to just go with what you expect, so your story can be focused on just the best bits. Yet, sometimes it could be cool to integrate scenes like the ones mentioned before. If you think about it, why not have a scene start when the detective is driving to the murder scene or having lunch? After all, who says there wouldn't be something exciting happening there? So, how can we account for these unexpected scenes? Well, in the next section, I will make the point that when you're playing Mythic, you really can focus on the main parts of your story and not spend time on more mundane details, because the system is already made to throw unexpected scenes at you from time to time. When you're coming up with a solo RPG story, you don't know exactly what is going to happen, but you should always have an idea of what your character wants to do, and some kind of expectation on what could happen. For example, if you're playing a wizard trying to open a portal to another dimension, you might start your scene with the expectation that he succeeds. In Mythic, when you start a new scene, you always have to spell out your expectation for the beginning of the scene. Here it could be, the wizard opens up a portal to the plane of fire. Then, as you probably know, you need to roll a d10 and compare your result to the chaos factor. The chaos factor is a counter that goes up or down at the end of each scene to keep track of how expectedly or unexpectedly things are going. If you get more than the chaos factor, you stay with the expected scene. In this case, the portal would be a success. So you may decide to roleplay the wizard trying to send things through the portal to test it out, or even crossing himself into the plane of fire. However, if you get equal or under your chaos factor, you get either an altered scene, which is supposed to be a slightly different scene than anticipated, or an unexpected scene, which is much more disruptive. For example, an altered scene could be that the spell fails and explodes into a ball of fire, so the wizard now needs to spend a scene preventing his whole laboratory from catching fire. Or perhaps the spell does work, but a fire demon jumps out of there and fights the wizard. However, if you get a result of an interrupt scene, this is where your scene may not start where and when you expect it to. When you have an interrupt scene, you need to roll on the random events table to get a few guidelines on what should happen next. Thus, you will have a result from the random events focus table and 2 keywords rolled from the meaning tables that will influence your idea. Usually, when you have an interrupt scene, it will make sense to put it in the story either before the scene you expected or instead of it. For example, if in our wizard story we rolled new NPC on the random events table and quarrelsomely extravagant on the descriptions meaning table, then perhaps instead of a demon leaping out of the portal, it could be some kind of pleasantly sassy fire elemental that swirls out of there. But with other results, the interruptions may have ranged from realizing he's missing a component for a spell and he has to go and gather it. Maybe he is visited by someone, or he is sidetracked by a new, more pressing problem, or maybe he does go through with the spell, but it doesn't lead to the plane of fire as expected, and instead it leads somewhere else, which makes him embark on a whole different journey. Of course, the limits of this are the limits of your imagination and how you can interpret the rolls you make when you get the interrupt scene. But the point is that it's through these altered and unexpected scenes that you will have the opportunity to add unplanned scenes in between the scenes you already had in mind. It's the element of surprise that transforms these moments into interesting events in your story, and more often than not, they will dramatically alter the course of your plot. And I find that it's often those unforeseen moments that will make your story truly original. To drive this point home, here's an example with the detective story I used earlier. Here is how you may word the first expected scene. The detective arrives at the murder scene and proceeds to investigate. This is what we would like to get, but if you get an altered scene, then your expectation has to be modified by a little bit. My first thought would be that there is a criminal still present on the scene, transforming this investigation into a chase. Otherwise, with an interrupt result, you may be inspired to include part of the story that seemed uninteresting at first. For example, here's where you could make a scene out of his morning routine or out of the drive to the crime scene, by deciding that something actually breaks the monotony when you roll an interrupt scene. For example, a roll of ambiguous event with keywords of befriend and hindrance may be interpreted to say that in the morning, the detective gets a flat tire and he needs to take a taxi to work. But doing so, he ends up talking to the driver and he learns a couple of useful things about the neighborhood where the crime took place. Okay, so now that you have an idea of what kinds of elements make a good scene and why you should build your expected scenes around events that keep the adventure moving, the next question is, well, when should you end the scene? And when should you use one scene versus multiple ones? This is more subjective, but let me give you some pointers. Mythic tells you to end scenes when whatever started the scene has been addressed. So if your scene is a conversation, it may end once you learned what you wanted or asked the question you needed to ask. If it's a fight, then it may end when one of the sides is defeated. If it's an investigation, it might be once you rolled for everything and found clues. If it's exploration, it might be when you move on to a new location or arrive at your destination. To help you, you can think of a movie. Usually a scene ends when the story moves on to another location or when time passes between interesting events. When you do that, sometimes you will have very short scenes, and sometimes they may be quite long. The other day I was testing out the Adventure Crafter by pairing it with a rule set called Toon. Basically, it lets you roleplay as a cartoon character. In my first scene, I was playing as a leopard police officer with a crush on an athlete. The scene literally went like this. The athlete sped past her in his car. She saw on her radar that he was speeding, so then she tried to run after him to get him to stop, but she failed her roll, fell flat on her face, and watched him drive off into the distance. End of scene. This scene was literally only a couple of lines of action and one skill check. I stopped the scene there because the whole point of the scene was for my character to get a pretext to talk to her crush. If I did catch up with him, there would have probably been a few dialogue lines and it would have ended right after it. In the next scene, I just got shy of my expectations by rolling an altered scene. It began when she arrived in the city, But alas, the athlete drove into a gated television studio parking lot, so for the rest of the scene, her goal was to find a way inside. To reiterate, these are both examples of scenes that end when my character fulfilled two conditions. One, she got a shot at achieving her goal for the scene, which is catching up with the athlete, and second, the end of the scene marked a change in location. These indications work pretty well in general, but let me tell you what happens when you follow them. The question is, what's the point of ending a scene? Well, for a short answer, ending a scene gives a chance to Mythic to throw something unexpected at you. Basically, you open your story to something coming in to complicate things and prevent your character from achieving their goal right away. Coming back to my example with the cartoon characters, if I didn't end my scene when the leopard lady entered into the television studio parking lot, then it probably would have made it a lot easier for her to talk to the athlete. Perhaps I could have asked a fate question like, does she catch up to him? Or I would have made a skill check. Either way, my outcomes would be limited to a yes or a no. However, by making it a new scene, I had to come up with an expectation and check for it. That way, my odds of getting something unexpected were a lot higher. Moreover, if an unforeseen event did occur, I could start the scene right in the middle of it by making use of an ellipsis. That way, I could focus my story on what is most interesting for me. Sure, Mythic can also throw unexpected events at you when you ask fate questions, but in that case, the odds of getting random events is a lot lower. In the roleplay, the next scene was indeed an unexpected one. So I decided the athlete was brought into a studio to appear in an interview. Meanwhile, my character had to search for a shooting schedule so she would find where the athlete was being interviewed. Through the unexpected scene, I ended up running into a disgraced TV host that was trying to erase surveillance footage showing evidence of her wrongdoings. This was a very long scene that spanned two locations, the parking lot and inside the offices of the studio. And I only chose to end it once this subplot of the TV host was dealt with and the lady got dragged out of the security room in handcuffs. I chose to make this one lengthy scene because I didn't want to veer off track too much. Moreover, while I did change locations, my protagonist's goal for the scene, which was to find the interview location, only got accomplished by the end of it. Alternatively, if I did start a new scene once my character got into the offices, I expect the subplot with the TV host would have become far more important and longer to resolve. Plus, because of an altered or interrupt scene, there might have been yet another subplot introduced to put obstacles into my character's path. So, a good rule of thumb with ending scenes or letting scenes drag on is the following. If you think it would be satisfying or appropriate to reach your goal in this scene, then let it drag on. However, if you think more obstacles would make your story better, end it at the next opportunity and start a new scene. Now let's go back to our example of the abandoned house in the woods. So we can answer the question, why cover that event with one or multiple scenes? If you cover that event with one scene, you're giving Mythic a chance to throw something unforeseen at you only at the beginning of the scene, when you're outside the house. If nothing happens then, maybe this will be a very quick scene where you just search the place for hidden treasures. Sure, during the scene you could ask, is the house haunted? Or, can my character sense magic in this place? But it wouldn't be as unexpected as getting similar outcomes by rolling for a new scene. At that point, you're just kind of forcing it. If you choose to start a second scene when you enter the house, then you give Mythic a second chance to disrupt the flow of things, this time right as you enter the mysterious location. Odds are, if you do that, you are likely to create a subplot involving the abandoned house. And if you don't, and instead decide to keep it as one long scene, but you end up with nothing much happening in that scene, then it's the fact that nothing happened in that scene that subverted your expectations. To sum up, broadly speaking, you will be ending scenes in the two following scenarios. 1. Your character has accomplished their goal for the scene, or at least they have tried to, and now it's time to change locations or go forward in time. 2nd, you want to give Mythic an opportunity to throw something unexpected at you, so you decide to create a change in location or an ellipsis. So the difference is either you have to change scenes because it's appropriate, or you bend the story a little bit, so then you can introduce a new scene. To give you a final example, here's how I would break down a typical adventuring day. 1. In the first scene, the adventurers are breaking down camp. This gives Mythic a chance for an unforeseen event right as they start the day. For example, maybe they got their food stolen, or someone got sick, or they see something interesting on the horizon. Great with that is you can get an unforeseen event that will guide the entire day. In the second scene, they are exploring the wilderness. This is where they may forage for food, find new locations, and come upon encounters. Any encounter triggers a separate scene. However, in case this is an uneventful day, this scene would just be made up of a few descriptions of the surroundings and a lot of rolls. 3rd, in case they find a location such as a ruin or a full-on dungeon, they would get one or multiple scenes in that location. As explained earlier, the more scenes you start, the higher the likelihood that something unexpected will happen. Usually, more scenes means more time is dedicated to these events. The final scene is when the adventurers are recovering from the day. This is where they may need to gather food if they didn't do so before, and roll to see if something or someone disturbs their rest. This breakdown is basically how I used to play Dungeons & Dragons with my friends. We would basically follow this outline without making it official. So you can easily recreate this experience in your solo adventures. I call this a simulation style adventure because you're already covering a lot of mundane details such as getting ready for the day and foraging and resting for the night. When I play solo adventures, I don't usually do simulation style. I usually do a more narrative or movie-like style. If you prefer that, you should simply put more ellipses. So you would probably start the day straight into the wilderness, or even when your players find a ruin or dungeon. Since you're using Mythic, you may still get scenes that cover your character's more mundane activities, like breaking down their camp or resting for the day. But in this case, this would only happen when Mythic disturbs your plans. So these quote-unquote mundane scenes would probably be full of drama, because there would be something happening. Anyhow, one way is not better than the other. It's just a matter of style of the kind of adventure you would prefer to have. Hopefully, thanks to my explanations, now you know how to choose when to start and end scenes, and you have an idea of which story elements and events to focus on so you can have the style of story you want. Doing so will enable you to spend more time on the parts of the story you find most interesting, and thanks to Mythic, you'll still get a chance to include parts of your adventure that you usually tend to ignore, but that could bring something surprising and unexpected to your story. So thank you all for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!